We interrupt this broadcast to bring you Sleepy Echo's Unwind broadcast, live from the hollowed-out heart of the Great Void. Starring Jackson, the stray who saw too much, and the strange, quiet folks who keep the lights burning on Briar Road. But things aren't always what they seem behind the picket fence, and the neighborhood is getting hungrier by the minute. Don't touch that dial. The show is about to breathe you in. Welcome to Sleepy Echo's Unwind, where the night remembers old stories. Light your lanterns, slow your breathing, and let us drift together into the hush of the night. Story 1, Miss Delaney's Replay. The wind in Great Void doesn't blow, it wheezes. It carries the scent of copper and old, sun-bleached bone, the ghost of a forgotten slaughterhouse. I shouldn't have stopped. I was a man defined by motion, leaving a life of quiet desperation behind me, but the light pulled me in. It was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, the kind of glow that feels like a bruise on the darkness, a stain that won't wash out. The porch light doesn't just shine. It vibrates. It's a low, wet thrum that rattles in your teeth and makes the fillings ache. I stood on the edge of the property, my shadow stretching out like a thin, nervous finger pointing toward the door. Every other house was a tomb, dark and silent. But here, the air tasted of ozone and impending rain. I checked my watch, a nervous habit from a life that ran on schedules. 2:16 a.m. I waited, my breath hitching in the dry air. Then it happened. Flicker, flicker, flicker. The rhythm wasn't electrical. It was biological. A frantic heartbeat. 3 quick pulses, then back to that steady, oppressive hum. My feet moved before my brain could argue, drawn by a curiosity I'd long thought dead. I climbed the stairs, each one groaning under my weight like a dying animal pleading for silence. I reached out to knock, my knuckles inches from the peeling white paint that looked like flaking skin. The door didn't just open, it retreated. It slid back into the throat of the house without a sound, a silent invitation into a mouth of shadows. Inside, the smell hit me. Lavender and formaldehyde, the perfume of a pristine corpse. It was a museum of the mundane, lace doilies on every surface, heavy velvet curtains absorbing all sound, and clocks, hundreds of them. Grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, tiny pocket watches pinned to the floral wallpaper like dead metallic butterflies. Every single one was frozen, their hands splayed out at different hours like the broken limbs of tiny dancers. Except for the one on the mantel. It was a tall, obsidian thing with a face made of polished bone. It wasn't ticking upward. The red numbers, glowing with a light that shouldn't exist in 1996, were bleeding backward in a silent, relentless cascade. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of a small, spindly cat with ears too big for its head was shivering in the corner, its entire body a tremor. Its eyes were massive, saucers of pure, unadulterated terror that had seen this scene unfold 1,000 times. It didn't meow. It just pointed a trembling claw at the kitchen, a desperate, silent warning. "The things we do for love," a voice rasped. It wasn't human. It sounded like 2 stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry well. I walked toward the sound, each step heavier than the last. The countdown was a physical weight now, pressing on my shoulders. In the kitchen sat a woman, or the memory of one. Miss Delaney was a shroud of gray lace and sunken skin, sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her sat a man in overalls with a cap pulled low, his face a mask of bitter indifference. He was holding a spoon, but he wasn't eating. He was staring at the wall, at a water stain shaped like a screaming face. Between them sat a pie. It was steaming, but the steam rose in perfect, unmoving spirals, frozen in the air like delicate glass sculptures. "You're late for the viewing," the woman whispered without moving her lips. The sound came from everywhere at once. The small cat crept up behind me, grabbing the hem of my coat with its teeth, pulling me toward the door with a desperate, surprising strength. Its whimpering was a high-pitched vibration in the back of my skull. "Stay!" the man in the cap suddenly barked. His voice cracked the silence like a whip. "The show's about to start." I tried to turn, but the floor felt like molasses, clinging to the soles of my boots. I looked at the obsidian clock. The porch light outside began to scream. Not a sound, but a light so bright it turned the windows into white fire, burning away the world outside. The cat let out a silent, wide-mouthed shriek, pulling its own long ears over its eyes. The world inverted. The floor didn't fall, it dissolved. I wasn't in a kitchen anymore. I was standing on a floating island of dirt in a void of bruised purple and black. The house was gone. The woman was gone. Only the man in the raincoat remained. But he was a giant now, a shadow spanning the horizon, holding a massive, brutalist remote control. He pressed a button, and the day reset. I found myself back at the edge of the property. The wind wheezed. My boots felt heavy. My mind felt like it had been scrubbed with steel wool, leaving only a faint, itchy residue of dread. I looked at the house. The porch light hummed. 2:16 a.m. Flicker, flicker, flicker. I reached for the door, my hand moving against my will. And in that moment, I understood the pink dog's terror. I looked down at my hands. The skin was smoothing out, the knuckles vanishing, the flesh taking on the grain of dark oak. I wasn't a drifter anymore. I was a prop. Story 2, the salesman's pitch. The next night, the wheezing wind carries the scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust. The floorboards, once groaning with a drifter's weight, are now silent, solid, and unnervingly smooth underfoot. It is 2:15 a.m. In the living room, the overseer pats the newly installed flooring, a faint look of satisfaction on his indifferent face. The silent matron rocks in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, weaving something from shadow and lint. Only Jackson the cat, hiding beneath the porch swing, seems to remember the man who became the wood. He watches the edge of the property, his tail twitching, sensing the approach of another player. The vacuum salesman didn't knock. He polished the brass knocker with his sleeve first. He was a man of high-gloss shoes and a grin that had too many teeth. Barnaby P. Glimmer, a professional who could sell a cloud to a fish and charge for the rain. He didn't see the sleek gray cat, Jackson, shaking behind the rotted porch swing. He didn't see the way the yellow light turned his sharp pinstriped shadow into a jagged, hungry thing. The door retreated into the dark. Barnaby stepped in, his heavy vacuum case thudding onto the floral rug with practiced confidence. "Good evening, madam. Is your carpet tired? Is your rug restless?" He didn't wait for an answer. He saw the silent matron in her rocking chair and the overseer sitting at the table, methodically sharpening a spoon. The obsidian clock on the mantel bled a fresh number. "I represent the Void Vac 9000, Barnaby chirped, his voice echoing in the unnerving stillness. "It doesn't just suck up dirt. It inhales the very essence of grime. It cleans things you didn't even know were there. Lingering regrets, forgotten sorrows, microscopic despair. The overseer turned his head. It made a sound like dry parchment tearing. "Does it clean memories?" he rasped. Barnaby's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. "Memories? Why, it'll take the stains right off your soul, sir. Look at this suction." Barnaby snapped the vacuum together. He flipped the switch. The machine didn't roar. It inhaled. A deep, cavernous gasp, as if a giant had been held under water for a century. Jackson watched with eyes the size of dinner plates. He saw what Barnaby didn't. The vacuum wasn't just pulling dust. It was pulling the color out of the room, the vibrant reds of the wallpaper fading to a sullen gray.
"See that?"
Barnaby shouted over the rising hum. "Absolute purity! Total erasure!" He thrust the nozzle toward the shadow under the kitchen table. The vacuum bucked in his hand. It groaned, a deep, metallic complaint. "Something's stuck," Barnaby grunted. He pulled. The vacuum pulled back, its motor whining in a tug-of-war for something unseen. Suddenly, the machine sighed, a sound of weary satisfaction. A thick, black sludge began to leak from the chrome canister. It wasn't dirt. It was hair. Long, gray, human hair, spilling out in wet, greasy clumps that smelled of lavender and formaldehyde. "Now look what you've done," the overseer whispered. He stood up, his frame seeming to unspool, taller than the ceiling should allow. "You wanted to clean, but in this house, the dirt is the tenant." The vacuum nozzle suddenly clamped onto Barnaby's hand with a sickening crunch.
"Ah! Hey! Let go!"
Barnaby's voice went thin, his bravado vanishing. His fingers weren't being pulled out of the machine. They were being compressed, flattened. His skin was turning a hard, polished white, like porcelain. His pinstripe suit began to fuse with his flesh, the fabric turning into a cold ceramic glaze. Barnaby tried to scream, but his mouth was hardening, stretching into a permanent, frozen O of surprise. His legs fused together into a heavy, weighted base. The overseer reached for the top of Barnaby's head as if he were a common household object. He twisted Barnaby's nose. Click. A blinding, jaundiced light erupted from Barnaby's frozen, screaming mouth. The world blinked. The void opened and shut like a cosmic eyelid. Jackson sat on the porch, shivering, the smell of ozone sharp in his nostrils. Inside, on the end table next to the silent matron, sat a new, expensive-looking floor lamp. It was shaped like a man in a pinstripe suit, his mouth wide open, screaming a solid beam of yellow light into the corner of the room. The overseer looked at the lamp and nodded, adjusting its angle slightly. Better. The lighting was always a bit dim. Story 3. The Morning Tea. Another night passes. The jaundiced light in the living room is brighter, harsher. It screams from the mouth of a pinstriped floor lamp shaped like a man in permanent, silent agony. It is 2:14 a.m. The overseer adjusts the lamp, angling the beam into a dusty corner as if testing its power. Jackson, the sleek gray cat, hides in the rafters of the porch, the new light casting his shadow long and distorted. He has learned to stay high, to watch the house consume its offerings from a distance. He grooms his fur with a frantic energy, the low hum of the house a constant vibration in his bones. The widow didn't arrive by car. She drifted up the cracked driveway like a piece of burnt paper caught in an updraft, her black veils trailing behind her. She carried a porcelain teapot that rattled with the sound of dry seeds. Jackson watched from the rafters. His tail was a frantic, rhythmic whip against the wood. He knew the house's hunger. He had seen the salesman turn into a pillar of light, and he had felt the drifter's memory under his paws as floorboards. The door folded inward like a lung collapsing, a soft, wet sigh. Mrs. Gable stepped into the foyer. Her face was a beautiful map of grief, etched with sorrow. She ignored the strange lamp and the silent figures, her eyes locking only on the obsidian timepiece on the mantel. "I've brought the blend," she whispered to the clock. "The one he always liked." In the kitchen sat the overseer, a man in a stained yellow raincoat, and the silent matron, her skin the color of old parchment, her hands still for once. "Sit," the overseer commanded. The word vibrated out of the new oak floorboards. Jackson crept along the crown molding, his claws finding no purchase on the slick paint. He wanted to bat the teapot out of the widow's hand, but the air was thick, and his paw passed through it like it was moving through cold syrup. "Don't drink," Jackson hissed, but the sound came out as a low, mournful yowl that the widow didn't hear. Mrs. Gable sat. She poured a thick, violet vapor from the teapot into a delicate cup. "He's been gone so long," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want to see him again. The man on the phone, the one who called about the estate, he said the light here could show me." The overseer leaned forward. "The light doesn't give," he rasped, a cruel patience in his tone. "The light records. If you want to see him, you have to become part of the gallery. You have to join the exhibit." Mrs. Gable drank, a desperate final swallow. As the vapor hit her throat, she began to fade. Her black dress flattened against the air, losing its texture.
I see him,
she cried, her voice echoing as her body lost its dimension.
He's in the walls. He's the pattern on the curtains. Oh, my love, what have they done to you?
Jackson watched in horror as Mrs. Gable's bones turned to ink. Her grief-stricken form stretched and curved until she was nothing more than a silhouette against the humming air. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a stain. The overseer stood up and peeled her off the atmosphere like a vinyl sticker from its backing. A bit too much grief in this one, he muttered, walking toward the kitchen window. It ruins the transparency. He pressed the flattened, ink-like remains of Mrs. Gable against the window pane. Flash. The world reset. Jackson was back in the rafters, his heart hammering. The driveway was empty. He looked down at the kitchen window. There, etched into the glass as a permanent, frosted tint, was the image of a weeping woman holding a teapot. She was the window itself, filtering the sickly yellow light into the room, forever trapped between the house and the world. The overseer sat back down. He looked at the new tint on his window and grunted. Matches the drapes, he whispered. Story 4. The Percussionist's Pulse. The following evening, the sickly yellow light filters into the house through a new, frosted pattern on the kitchen window, the weeping silhouette of a woman holding a teapot. It is 2:13 a.m. The overseer sips a cup of steaming black liquid, admiring how the new window tint matches the drapes. The house feels more complete, more insulated from the outside world. From the rafters, Jackson watches the window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He can feel the house's hunger growing, becoming more specific, more artistic. It's no longer just collecting pieces, it's decorating. He arrived in a velvet suit that seemed to absorb the sickly porch light, leaving a patch of deeper darkness where he stood. Professor Marrow carried a single silver tuning fork. He vibrated toward the door, his head tilting as if listening to a conversation happening just beneath the skin of the world. "It's flat," Marrow whispered, striking the fork against the doorframe. "A whole step flat." The sound hung in the air, refusing to fade, turning into a visible ribbon of gray smoke. The door dissolved into a puddle of black oil that seeped into the ground. Marrow stepped over it, unfazed. The overseer sat at the kitchen table, his yellow raincoat dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic plink. The silent matron was knitting a sweater out of human shadows, pulling strands of darkness from the corners of the room. "The house has a murmur," Marrow said, his voice a melodic baritone. "A fascinating arrhythmia." He knelt and pressed his ear to the floorboards, which were still warm from the drifter's soul. The floorboards began to rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. The house was breathing. Marrow pulled a golden drumstick from an inner pocket of his velvet suit and began to beat a complex, syncopated rhythm on the walls. The house groaned, not in pain, but in what sounded like ecstasy. The very foundations shuddered in time with his beat. But as the clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, Marrow's own heartbeat began to audibly sync with the house. His ribs began to poke through his velvet suit, the fabric stretching thin, turning into white ivory xylophone keys that resonated with each beat. The overseer stood up, his eyes gleaming. He retrieved the spoon he had been sharpening earlier and began to play a discordant, haunting melody on Marrow's chest. Flash. The reset hit. Jackson blinked. The house was quiet. But now, the staircase wasn't made of wood. Each step was a giant, polished ivory rib, and when the overseer walked up to bed later that night, the house didn't creak. It played a low, haunting C minor chord with each footstep. Story 5. The Collector of Reflections. The house is quiet tonight, save for the faint, musical chime that echoes each time the overseer ascends the stairs. Each step, a giant ivory rib, plays a low, haunting note. It is 2:12 a.m. The overseer stands at the top of the new staircase, a masterpiece of bone, tapping his foot and listening to the C minor chord it creates. The silent matron pauses her knitting, her head tilted towards the morbid melody. Jackson, perched on the crown molding, flattens his ears. The house no longer just breathes. It has found its voice, a song played on the bones of its guests. Madame Valeska didn't have a face. She had a veil of shimmering mercury that shifted and swirled with her mood, reflecting a distorted, funhouse version of the world. She carried a heavy velvet-lined trunk full of empty silver-backed hand mirrors, her life's obsession to capture the perfect angle. She stepped into the hallway, and the air turned cold enough to crack teeth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. Jackson's fur stood on end. He saw his own reflection in her shifting veil, but his reflection was a terrified terrier, barking silently at the ceiling. "Too many shadows," Valeska hissed, her voice like cracking glass. "Not enough perspectives." She began hanging her mirrors on the walls. Every mirror showed a different room, not of this house, but of other places, other times. A child's nursery from the 1950s, a blood-spattered abattoir. The overseer walked into the hall, holding a bucket of viscous silver paint. "You're missing a piece," he rasped. He splashed the paint onto the floor, where it didn't dry. It became a deep, bottomless pool of liquid chrome. Valeska gasped, mesmerized. She leaned over the pool to see her true face, the one hidden behind the mercury. Suddenly, her veil began to drip, long silver tendrils pouring from her face into the pool on the floor. She was being undone, her essence siphoned away. Valeska didn't disappear. She stretched. Her form thinned and flattened, becoming impossibly wide. She was pulled taut, becoming the very silver backing of the mirrors she had brought. Flash. Jackson woke up on the rug. The hallway was different. The walls were gone, replaced by floor-to-ceiling panels of flesh-warm glass. Everywhere Jackson looked, he saw thousands of versions of himself, all trapped behind the silver, watching the overseer walk past, his image infinitely multiplied. Story 6. The Gardener of Static. The next night is a kaleidoscope of terror. The hallway walls are no longer wallpapered, but lined with flesh-warm glass that reflects an army of overseers. It is 2:11 a.m. He walks the hall, his reflection multiplying into infinity, each mirror showing a slightly different version of himself. He seems pleased, touching the silvery surface that was once Madame Valeska. Jackson avoids the hallway entirely, hissing at his own distorted image, which sometimes appears as a dog, a bird, or simply a smear of terrified fur. The house has become a fun house, and he is the only one not amused. Old Man Gable arrived with a burlap bag of gray seeds that hummed with white noise. He was the husband the widow had been looking for, drawn to the same light. He knelt in the dirt by the porch, his fingers gnarled like tree roots. "The static needs feeding," Gable muttered. "The signal is weak." As soon as the seeds hit the soil, they didn't grow plants. They grew television antennas, sprouting from the earth like metallic weeds. The overseer walked onto the porch, holding a watering can filled with liquid electricity that crackled and sparked. He watered the antennas. They began to sprout fuzzy gray leaves made of television static. The air filled with the disembodied sound of 1,000 dead channels, whispers and fragments of forgotten broadcasts.
I can see the future in the snow!
Gable cried, hugging one of the metal stalks.
I can see my wife! She's in the window!
The antennas were growing into him now. The metal stalks pierced his overalls and wrapped around his limbs like vines. His eyes began to flicker with black and white images. His wife's weeping face, a sleek gray cat, and an old couple he didn't know, sitting in a living room that wasn't his.
The signal is clear now!
Gable shrieked, his voice turning into a high-pitched electronic whine. The overseer reached out and turned a knob that had sprouted from Gable's ear. Gable's body collapsed, folding in on itself with a series of sickening cracks, until he was a boxy, wooden shape. Flash. Jackson stood in the yard. The antennas were gone, but in the corner of the living room sat a new, vintage television set with a polished wood finish. Its screen was made of Gable's stretched, pale skin. When the overseer turned it on, the only thing it showed was a live, silent, black and white feed of Jackson sitting on the porch, looking in. Story 7. The Architect of Echoes. Static fills the living room, a constant humming snow emanating from a new vintage television set in the corner. Its screen, made of stretched skin, flickers. It is 2:10 a.m. The overseer sits before it, watching the only channel it receives, a live black and white feed of Jackson sitting on the porch, looking in. The house can now watch itself. The loop is tightening. Jackson, outside, can feel the electronic gaze on his fur, a tingling sensation like 1,000 tiny insects. He refuses to enter, pacing the perimeter of the property as if trapped in an invisible cage. The visitor arrived carrying a tube of blueprints that bled blue ink onto his hands. Arthur Vane was a man of sharp angles and hollow spaces, all severe haircut and starched collar. "The foundations are screaming," he whispered, placing a level on the porch rail. The bubble slid violently to one side. "Unacceptable." The door inhaled, pulling Vane into the hallway with a rush of air. The overseer stood at the top of the new bone staircase. The silent matron sat in the parlor, sewing a zipper into the air itself, opening and closing a small, dark tear in reality. "I can fix the lean," Vane shouted, his voice echoing 3 times in the strange acoustics. "This structure is fundamentally unsound." He began hammering long silver nails into the shadows on the wall, convinced he was reinforcing the studs. Jackson watched from the doorway as the shadows bled a dark, thick liquid around the nails. The house wasn't made of wood. It was made of patience. Vane pulled out a measuring tape to find the center of the foyer, but it didn't stop. It spooled out, wrapping around his own waist, then the banister, pulling him tight. "The house needs more support," the overseer rasped from the top of the stairs. "A central beam." Vane tried to scream, but his mouth filled with sawdust. His limbs stiffened and lengthened, his joints locking with loud cracks. His spine cracked and straightened, the vertebrae fusing, turning into a 4x4 beam of solid, dark oak. The overseer descended the stairs and grabbed Vane, now a towering wooden pillar, and slammed him into the center of the foyer. "Perfect," he whispered, wiping a fleck of sawdust from his raincoat. It was sagging right here. Flash. Jackson woke on the rug. In the middle of the hall stood a beautiful, hand-carved mahogany pillar, its grains swirling like a tormented face. If you pressed your ear to the wood, you could hear a muffled, terrified heartbeat. The overseer patted the pillar. "Solid as a rock," he muttered. Story 8. The Chemical Ghost. The air in the house is thick with the smell of sawdust and something ancient. In the center of the foyer stands a new, hand-carved mahogany pillar, beautiful and solid, where there was once empty space. It is 2:09 a.m. The overseer pats the pillar, its wood warm to the touch, and listens to the faint, muffled heartbeat within. "Solid," he mutters. The house feels structurally sound, its architecture reinforced with the essence of its visitors. Jackson, having finally crept back inside, gives the pillar a wide berth. He can hear the screaming heart inside the wood and knows the house is nearly finished with its construction. He didn't walk, he stomped. Vance Vile, a man encased in a bulky, rubberized yellow hazmat suit, carried a pressurized tank labeled Oblivion. "Infestation!" His voice crackled through a static-laced speaker. "I smell something living, breathing in the insulation." He kicked the door open, foregoing the house's silent invitation, and stepped into the foyer. Jackson hissed from the shadows. The overseer stood in the kitchen doorway, unmoving. "The bugs are in the walls!" Vance barked, pumping the handle of his tank aggressively. He pulled the trigger. A thick, neon green gas billowed out, smelling of artificial pine and acid. "Stop!" the overseer rasped, his voice cutting through the hiss of the gas. "The house is the guest. You're the pest." Vance laughed, a distorted electronic cackle. "I don't kill 'em, pal. I dissolve 'em. Erase the problem." He turned the nozzle toward the overseer, but the gas flowed backward, defying physics, snaking into the intake valves of Vance's own mask. "Something's wrong with the seals," he wheezed, his voice panicked. His rubber suit began to inflate, stretching until it was thin and semi-transparent. Inside, you could see a swirling, chaotic soup of the house's collected essences. The salesman's pinstripes, the widow's black lace, the architect's sawdust, all churning in the green gas. I'm full!" Vance shrieked, his limbs losing definition within the bulging suit. The overseer calmly walked over and tapped the glass visor. "No," he whispered. "You're the filter." Vance's body snapped and compressed with a wet, final pop. The rubber suit fused with the metal tank, shrinking and hardening into a small, squat machine. Flash. Jackson walked into the kitchen. In the corner sat a new, heavy-duty air purifier. It hummed with a low, wet rattle, and every few minutes emitted a tiny, muffled cough. The overseer leaned over and inhaled deeply at the vent, a look of serene pleasure on his face. "Clean," he murmured. "Finally, the air is clean." Season finale. The script is written in skin. The night of the finale, the house is finally complete. It is 2:08 a.m. The overseer walks through his creation, admiring the pieces. He stomps on the floorboards, solid and silent underfoot, a faint memory of the drifter who stopped for a rest. In the living room, he adjusts the pinstriped lamp, its light screaming from the salesman's porcelain mouth. He runs a hand over the kitchen window, where the grieving widow is forever etched into the glass, tinting the light with her sorrow. He ascends the stairs, each step a musical chord played on the percussionist's very ribs. In the hall, he smiles at his own infinite reflections, caught in the mirrored walls that were once a collector of reflections. In the corner of the living room, the skin-screen television flickers, showing the cat outside, a permanent broadcast from the gardener of static. He pats the hand-carved mahogany pillar in the foyer, feeling the architect's faint, terrified heartbeat within. Finally, in the kitchen, he inhales deeply from the air purifier, a machine made from a man in a hazmat suit, its filter now catching the last vestiges of unwanted reality. "Perfect," the overseer whispers. The set is dressed. Jackson feels a change in the atmosphere. The low hum of the countdown clock is gone. Instead, a new sound begins, a high-pitched whine, as if the house is powering up for its grand performance. The obsidian clock didn't count down. The numbers scrolled upward, blurring into a solid red line of pure energy. The overseer walked to the center of the room and peeled off his yellow raincoat. Underneath, he wasn't a man. He was a lattice of flickering television tubes and copper wiring, his chest a glowing screen of violent static. "The pilot season is over, Jackson," the overseer rasped, his voice now a chorus of electronic buzzing. "The audience, they want a bigger sacrifice for the finale." The silent matron stood up, her knitting needles glowing white-hot as she knitted the very walls together, sealing the house completely. The clock was counting up, a timer for the broadcast. The house began to whine. The salesman lamp screamed a beam of light that erased the rug, turning it into a 2D cartoonish drawing on the floor. "Look at the craft! The production value!" the overseer shouted, his screen chest flashing images of every victim, their last horrified moments on a loop. "They aren't dead, Jackson. They're syndicated." Jackson leaped for the window, his only hope for escape, but the widow glass was now a mirror. He didn't see a gray cat. He saw a charcoal sketch of a cat, his fur losing its texture, becoming simple pencil strokes on a flat plane. The overseer grabbed a giant, rusted remote control that materialized from the humming air. "Time to change the channel," he whispered. He pointed the remote at the kitchen wall, which unrolled like a cheap paper backdrop. Beyond was not the yard, but a void of swirling purple clouds. There, in a giant armchair made of thunder and decaying stars, was the real tenant. It was a giant, pink, hairless creature with 3 vacant eyes, eating popcorn that looked like shrunken heads from a bucket the size of a mountain. We're just a Saturday morning cartoon, Jackson. The overseer laughed, a sound of crackling despair. And the giant is bored. The giant reached down, its hand blotting out the swirling cosmos. It didn't grab the house. It reached for a colossal, glowing plug in the sky above.
No!
The overseer shrieked, his static form flickering wildly.
The loop! We need the loop! The ratings were just getting good!
The giant pulled the plug. The jaundiced light died. The house, the overseer, and the static dissolved into a single thin white line that zipped into nothingness. Jackson felt himself falling, the pencil lines of his form dissolving into dust. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in a dusty, empty field. There was no house, no briar road, just a single rotted wooden sign half buried in the dirt. It read, "Scene deleted." Jackson stood up, his fur real once more, solid and warm in the alien sun. He looked back. In the dirt where the house once stood lay a single, bone-white clock hand. Jackson turned and walked into the desert, the only character to ever escape the script. Until, that is, epilogue. A soft focus. The desert gave way to a patch of impossible green. In the center sat a cottage of sun-bleached wood and slate, smelling of honeysuckle and baking bread. Jackson had walked for 3 days. Here the air was sweet and clean, without the tang of ozone or decay. Life with Pearl was a dream, a soft focus fantasy. Pearl was a woman of floral print aprons and flower-dusted hands, her laughter like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Jackson spent his days draped across her lap, the rhythmic creak of her rocking chair soothing, not a countdown. It was a rhythm of peace. "You're a good boy, Jackson," Pearl whispered, scratching behind his ears. "So tense when you arrived. Nothing but peace in this house." The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Jackson was purring, half asleep, safe. Click. The garden gate swung open. A sharp metallic snap. Jackson's ears swiveled. His purr died in his throat, replaced by a cold knot of ice. Then came the footsteps. High-gloss shoes on the stone path. Clack, clack, clack. Ding-dong! The sound was cheery, melodic, but to Jackson, it was a funeral bell. He leaped from Pearl's lap, his fur standing on end, a low growl starting deep in his chest. "Oh, goodness," Pearl giggled, wiping her hands on her apron. "A visitor at this hour? How lovely." Jackson stood at her feet, his yellow eyes fixed on the gap beneath the door. A familiar, sharp shadow stretched across the welcome mat. Pearl turned the handle. The man standing on the mat wore a pinstripe suit. His shoes reflected the setting sun like black diamonds. He held a heavy chrome case and a wide, toothy grin that never touched his cold, dead eyes. "Good evening, madam. Is your carpet tired? Is your rug restless?" He stepped forward. For a split second, as across the threshold, his skin looked like polished porcelain, and his eyes flickered with the red glow of a digital countdown. "I represent the Voidvac 9000, he said, his grin widening as he looked past Pearl and into the cozy home. "It cleans things you didn't even know were there." Jackson didn't hiss. He threw his head back and let out a jagged, soul-shattering shriek, the sound of a character realizing the show hadn't been canceled, it had just been picked up by a new network. The loop had found him. Well, that's all for now, listener. A new story is about to be filmed, it seems. Should Jackson try to warn Pearl, or is she already part of the set? Let me know in the comments below. Until then, blow out your lantern, close your eyes, and drift off into the hush of the night. We shall meet again,